We've got a lot of pretty good examples of park rangers, foresters, conservation police, forest protection officers, everybody trying to manage this. Examples of human management with respect to wildlife is a lot more visible in a lot more places because people are so attracted to wildlife. So we've got things like signs. And we'll get into sort of the specific behavioral psychology of signs later, but this is a prescriptive injunctive sign. This sign is using humor, but it's using humor to blunt the sting a little bit of a positive or affirmative command. So prescriptive is yes, do, or like the desired behavior. And injunctive means it's a command form. So if you throw this, you go get it. Ha ha. Okay? A fed bear is a dead bear is a very, very common sort of big block letters, kind of a block or poster type font that, you know, signals that you mean business. Like you don't write a fed bear is a dead bear in Comic Sans or Papyrus or a handwriting font. You're trying to sensitize people, not with a command this time, but a descriptive, proscriptive message. Right? Proscriptive is a negative message. This is a bad thing. We don't want this to be the outcome. So it's a proscriptive message. And it's a descriptive message because it's not issuing a command, it's using a to be verb to suggest how things have been, how they are, or how they could be, or how they will be. All right? Proscriptive, descriptive message. This next sign is using the same approach, using signs, not slapping people with fines and so forth. But take a second to read through this here. All right, so if you can't read it from the back, it goes, due to the frequency of human-bear encounters, the British Columbia Fish and Wildlife Branch is advising hikers, hunters, fishermen, and any persons that use the out-of-doors in a recreational or work-related function to take extra precautions while in the field. That's all one sentence, 5 lines of text. And yellow on green, not a good look for anybody who's colorblind or has low contrast vision. Next paragraph, we advise the outdoorsman to wear little noisy bells on clothing so as to give advance warning to any bears that might be close to you so you don't take them by surprise. We also advise anyone using the out-of-doors to carry pepper spray with him in case of an encounter with a bear. Outdoorsmen should also be on the watch for fresh bear activity and be able to tell the difference between black bear feces and grizzly bear feces. Black bear feces is smaller and contains lots of berries and squirrel fur. Grizzly bear shit has bells in it and smells like pepper. Pepper spray. Ha, ha, ha. Okay? So the idea here is let's use a little bit of humor. Let's describe what we do want people to do. So this is a prescriptive, descriptive message. And so the previous one, which was proscriptive, descriptive. But here's the problem. You got to read 4 paragraphs of fairly technical sounding text, like not a 6th grade reading level, to get to the punchline. So, one of the primary takeaways we're going to see in this approach, that is using signs instead of interdiction, or fences, physical barriers, or requiring the use of spotting scopes, long distance vision tools. Signs are easy, signs are cheap, and signs don't work very well. I've done a lot of this research at a bunch of national parks, and signs just don't get the people that you need to target to do something different, do something better. Okay? So, we have in cases where it's too late, like we've got food-attracted animals working through campgrounds, or in this case, boat ramps, or what have you, looking for food scraps, panhandling. The first approach is typically to trank dart the larger and more mobile animal, trying tranq dart the more charismatic species instead of shooting them outright, and trailer them away once or twice. And if they come back, well then we have tried, and it's gonna get really, really expensive. And it's a kind of a shitty thing to do as a land manager, to take a problem animal and truck it 300 miles away to solve the problem, but now it's somebody else's problem. And this bear is actively already looking for human food. So you can't really keep bussing him out further and further and further. The way Texas is humans, up to places like Chicago, you give them a shot of tranquilizer and then you have them shot if they come back and it's still a problem. It's unfortunate, it's very unpopular, and it is, I mean, look at that face. You're gonna shoot Smokey the bear? No, this is Smokey's meth head, drug addict, food addict friend, right? So yeah, it puts a lot of staff at risk to get it done, because dosing, as explained by my veterinarian wife, is a very, very fine art. So, tranquilizer is the same thing as a lethal poison. And the dose difference here is really pretty small. So, the reason, or one of the reasons, that American medical care is extremely expensive is because you're paying a whole team of people when you go in for surgery, the anesthesiology team, to poison you in an extremely controlled dose, because a little bit more than that is going to kill you, and a little bit less than that, you're going to be paralyzed but awake on the operating room table. And there are some stories of that where people are not anesthetized and they're not getting the analgesic effect, that is the freedom from pain effect, and it's pretty much torture. Imagine somebody cutting you open and you can't even move. All right, so that's tough. That's risky for the animal, and it's risky for the humans on both sides of that pulse dose and treatment response of tranquilization. So while they're getting silly, you're in danger. And while they're waking up from being silly, you're in danger. All right? This is also an issue because sometimes the tranquilization has to happen after cornering the animal. And cornering the animal does what? Causes a charge, right? So now we are causing the very kind of behavior, in some cases, that we are seeking to ameliorate. Another issue is, for example, with bears, in particular bear cubs, if they get treed, they can stay up there for a while, and if you tranquilize an animal in a tree, now you've got the dose problem and the uncontrolled fall problem as well. Okay? So, lots and lots of risks and problems associated with tranquilization. We can't just sort of wave a tranq gun at something to make the problem go away. So instead, here's what we do often do. We close access to that rare, threatened, or endangered species habitat. Those loons in Lake Umbagog National Wildlife Refuge. Those peregrine falcons at Acadia National Park. They're no longer nearly as endangered or threatened in the same way as they once were in the 1960s and 70s. So we are regaining access to some core bald eagle habitat for recreation purposes these days, right? This isn't a one-way, close it down for all time, nuke it from orbit, this is the only way to be sure, kind of a story. This is close access functionally permanently. We're going to keep it closed as long as it has to be, and that may be for some period of years. But when that population rebounds, when we as the managers have had a chance to enrich that habitat, increase the supply of that habitat for those animals, and kind of reshape human behavior, norms, expectations, impacts, then we can reopen it. And that's a really fun moment. you get to take advantage of your previous colleagues, like the previous generation worth of foresters, working their butts off to get these things reintroduced and in a more stable footing. And you get to cut the ribbon on the new trail system that goes through their habitat at certain times of year and is closed typically seasonally at sensitive times like nesting. All right. Second, restrict access around breeding and rearing places and times. So this is a finer scalpel to cut with than closing off access, right? So this is a very, very common thing. There's lots of examples of this even in southern Illinois. So if it sounds familiar that a trail is closed because of such and such species being sensitive at that time of year, then right, you're seeing this strategy on your hike. You can use human behavioral psychology and environment perception, not against people, but for the benefit of sensitive wildlife species. So, for example, if we've got some real sensitive habitat and very sharp relief between that habitat and a trail, like if we've got cliff nesting birds halfway down a cliff and we've got a trail at the top of that cliff or at the bottom of that cliff, we might be okay if it's a really tall cliff. If it's a short, like bluff line, 6, 8, 12, 15 feet tall, then that's functionally within range from the top and bottom, and no matter where that bank nesting bird, like a kingfisher, for example, is, it's within reach, and this is the wrong strategy. But because humans are genuinely, effectively an out of sight, out of mind kind of organism, that means if they can't see it, they can't get the bad idea to go bother it. That make sense? So sometimes your wildlife conservation efforts are best spearheaded through your trails team instead of through your wildlife habitat management team. The HAB management team is letting the trail crew know, hey, this area here is super problematic and we got this campsite in there and this trail accessing it. Can we just like low-key or high-key shut that one down for a couple of years and obliterate it and run or relocate that section of trail around the backside of the running ridge nearby? It's the same number of miles of trail. We'll open up a new campsite on this new section of trail. Good to go. Nobody is inconvenienced. And we just leave that wildlife alone. Okay? So a trail network is typically 100th or 1,000% of the total land mass through which those trails are running. So we can afford to be pretty picky and selective on where we kind of consume those square meters of trail surface. I'm going to put them away from the wildlife. Now, this gets tricky because trails are expensive and slow to build, take a lot of sweat equity, and a lot of trails have been around for a very long time, like a century before we had any sense of ecological management. The trails at Acadia National Park, there's right around 100 miles of managed, like formal Park Service maintained trails currently at Acadia National Park. And over the last century, they have been closing off the first 100 miles of trail of what was once a more than 200-mile trail network, because Mount Desert Island, where Acadia is not that big. It's like 75,000 acres, right? Tiny. I mean, it's Shawnee National Forest size, tiny. And with 200 plus miles of trails and a couple of mountain peaks, maybe a dozen mountain peaks in that space, they're ridge lines, they're not peaks. They're hardened magma bubbles, pretty cool stuff. Anyway, or magma waves. And every one of those peaks had 4 or 5 different ways up. So at Cadillac Mountain, the highest peak on the island, there is a north side trail, a south side trail, an east side trail, and a west side trail. And at some point, you don't need like 4 or 5 different trails accessing each peak. The view is the same from all of the trails after some elevation. So shut down 3 of the 4 trails, right? You don't have to accept somebody else's previous and less informed idea as gospel, right? This is an active revision kind of a thing. So part of our efforts here is going to be to take a look at the interface of the Trails Network with the habitat polygons on the map of your particular national park, and look at where like the sensitive habitat is getting crisscrossed or Swiss cheesed by a whole bunch of trails and campsites and stuff like that, and looking for other options that are just as good but don't run afoul of those polygons. Okay, so reduce facility presence in open areas. This is just a pure line of sight thing, not out of sight, out of mind, but for more sensitive wildlife like elk that are moving away, if they're not habituated, hundreds or dozens of hundreds of meters, or a dozen hundred meters, 12, 13, 1400 meters away when people start approaching. That's a line of sight issue, right? So if we can't see them or they can't see us, that's a better situation. If we can't see them and they can't see us, best situation. If we have to accommodate a whole bunch of visitors, right? But remember, those wildlife viewing opportunities are like the #1 reason for most of your visitors to show up to your park. So the Grand Canyon's nice, but have you seen them elk? Okay. So let's set up some wildlife viewing positions, some blinds, and pave a parking lot to them, and set them up in such a way where the people can see the wildlife with pro-grade spotting scopes that are permanently installed at these wildlife viewing areas. And the wildlife is 3/4 of a mile away and doesn't care that your visitors are kind of mobbing those observation sites and trying to hold their cell phone up to the telescope to try and get that like shaky, blurry picture, right? We've all done it, no big deal. So, lower the visual pressure of humans on the wildlife, okay? While preserving humans' ability to see those wildlife, and you're gonna go pretty well, all right? We need to take a look at the profile of your visitors. At Ozark National Scenic Riverways, it's like almost all Americans. And at Golden Gate National Recreation Area in San Francisco, or Muir Woods, which is real close to there, it's like not 99% white guys. So we need to think outside of our box here and say the same thing, but say it efficiently enough where you can get the idea across in one sentence and pay a whole bunch of people to translate that one sentence to a whole bunch of different languages, typically your top 3 or 5, okay? And use non-word communication like the international no symbol and be okay with that. Managers really hate fielding signs like this. Most of us who get into park rangering are not out to ruin everybody's day, right? So we don't like using block letters. We don't like using bright red no, prohibited skull and crossbones signs, warning triangles, stuff like that. But where somebody is legit gonna get black plague from that squirrel, or the fleas on that squirrel, we gotta go there, okay? Intensive impacts require intensive management. So we can write that down as like one of the governing laws of this class. Intensive use requires intensive management, okay? So the information education approach is on signs, but it's also in the verbal messages of volunteer or professional staff at your park making visitor contacts, okay? So this is an indirect approach. I'm not forcing you to change your behavior. I'm dropping knowledge bombs on you in the hope that you will choose and want to choose to make the right informed decision, okay? So that's indirect. It's popular among visitors and managers when you survey them, and it works okay-ish, right? So we found at Acadia National Park that an information education approach to staying on the trail worked about 70-75% of the time among an international crowd of at Acadia showing up on their Airbnb trips, their cruise ships, and those cruise ship charter buses, and their private, stays in the campground and stuff like that. This works about 70% of the time. Information and education. And then limiting use, that is putting up that fence. In this case, this is a Grand Canyon. That low rock wall is a direct physical interdiction. Now, a child can climb over that wall, but it's a clear symbolic message of, we're okay on this side of the wall, and you're outside the wire on that side of the wall. Do not do that, okay? So, sometimes your physical facility design, like a fence or a wall, anything that copes or bounds, clearly visibly bounds a space, sends a pretty clear message, a more effective message than signage. Okay? So, this wall keeps over 99% of visitors from going over the other side of the wall and down the cliff. Okay? And you are not seeing any signs that say, don't climb this wall. People see that and they're like, oh, I shouldn't climb that wall because that's a cliff face right there. Okay. Another direct management approach, like installing a wall, is to modify the facility resource, okay? So you can use prohibitive symbolic communication, and this is a real thing. In a study where we have a boot print, like a Vibram boot sole with that same red circle and slash through it saying don't step here, or symbolically saying don't step here, we got feedback from visitors saying, well, I walked through there anyway. I couldn't figure out why there was a sign that said no pine cones. Like, a non-0% of our visitors were dumb enough or mendacious enough to say, oh, well, I thought that said no pine cones. And I didn't see any pine cones while I was walking past there, so I guess I'm okay. Right? We call this willful ignorance, and it's a problem. But people generally know when they are trying to misbehave in that particular way. So, in terms of facility design, instead of relying on those signs, you can do things like install bear boxes, right? It's a steel lock box that, as we were talking about on Monday, the dumbest visitor has to be just smart enough to operate a bear box, and hopefully that bear box's locking mechanism is just smarter than the smartest bear. But you run into problems when the dumbest person is not smarter than the smartest bear. Overlaps, people. Venn diagrams. Human evolution accelerated by black bears. All right. So one thing that's sort of a non-intuitive result of installing bear boxes, physically hardening the landscape to remove the wildlife impact of food attraction, is that it became part of the experience. People got really excited when they saw first-gen bear boxes, bear poles, stuff like that installed in major Park Service campgrounds. They're like, oh shit, boy, what up? Or, yo, what that bear box do? Right? It's a signal to them that doesn't have any signage necessarily on it. It's just a brown steel box that says, without really saying anything, this place is kind of a big enough deal, honestly, that we have to manage bears with steel boxes, so you might get lucky and see a bear. And so that was, like, a lot of managers were a little bit hesitant to take on the expense and the labor of doing this, because these are heavy purpose-built boxes. You can't go to Walgreens and buy one of these. You gotta put them on concrete pads and stuff, and this is this whole thing. And then eventually you gotta jackhammer them out and replace them as they corrode and stuff like that. But the visitor response to this was so positive that, oh, okay, I'm a little bit safer because this is here, and oh, like, they're really serious. There are definitely, clearly bears here for them to shell out thousands of dollars for each one of these. So let's effing go. was kind of the response that people were saying in so many words. So if you've ever seen a bear-resistant trash can, that's exactly what's going on with that. And generally speaking, people really actually play along with these. They'll use them if they're available. Okay? So the next move is not a facility modification, but using the facility in a very specific way. This is a Park Service presence patrol. They're not hunting anybody down. They're not doing other stuff. They're just rolling through the campground at specific times of day, usually as everybody is posted up at their picnic table having breakfast, lunch, or dinner. And they just take 10 minutes and roll around, and they go on about the rest of their work, and so forth. So at Grand Canyon, especially where, man, a bit of food gets left out unsupervised for like 5 seconds, and the ravens are after it. Big old Rex Goliath chicken-sized birds tearing apart people's coolers and stuff. Those presence patrols help people remember, oh yeah, I saw that not fine print when I checked in about not leaving any food out, and these guys are pretty serious about it because I'm seeing them staffing these patrols. All right, so that worked out really well. We'll run through a more detailed case study, kind of soup to nuts, for Mammoth Cave. Did anybody pick Mammoth Cave as your park? No, okay. So the bats are pretty sensitive to human incursion, obviously. They're extremely sensitive acoustically and to light and to any other kind of disturbance. And at the same time, 95 to 99% of local bat populations in the eastern half or eastern two-thirds now of the United States have been killed in a matter of a couple of years by Geomyces destructans, white nose syndrome. It's a naturally occurring, essentially cave fungus. So Geomyces, earth fungus, in Europe, but it spread to the United States a couple of decades ago and started wrecking face among bat populations real hard. It grows basically like athlete's foot, also a fungus, on the faces, mouths, bodies of, generally around the mucous membranes of bats. And it just kind of, if you've ever had a foot fungal infection or like jock itch or roundworm or something like that, it just kind of low-key itches all the time or burns a little bit. Well, imagine that like all over your body and on like your eyelids and in your ears and around your mouth as a bat while you're trying to hibernate. So what it would do is kind of half wake them up out of torpor, and they'd scratch a little bit and then fall back asleep. But even that act of waking up a little bit, scratching, falling back asleep was spending calories they didn't have. And so these bats are starving to death from a terminal athlete's foot infection, if that makes sense. Okay? So, Mammoth Cave by the numbers to establish the historic context. Established during World War, or right before American involvement in World War I or II, and it's about a 6 mile by 6 mile square-ish shaped park in central Kentucky. And it was an absolute, like, armpit of hell tourism trap in central Kentucky. There wasn't a lot else economically going on in this particular area at that time. And so cave operators were buying lands from farms, running cave tours and stuff, and doing things like, you know, the early 20th century equivalent and late 19th century during slavery equivalent of like patriotic music and laser light shows, that kind of a thing. Like, imagine trying to tart up Mammoth Cave because it's not exciting enough somehow, you know? That's what was going on. So folks were like, United States government, can you rescue us from ourselves and set up a national park here instead of all of these ridiculous tourist trap kinds of things? There you go. All right. So it looks a lot like Southern Illinois in terms of, or not really Southern Illinois exactly, but northern Ozark, southern Missouri, karst cave environment, limey cave environment. You see that same blue-green water coloration that we did at Ozarks. Lots of rural communities in that area. Camping, hiking, horseback riding, stuff like that. This is a very chemically and biologically sensitive place. So there are lots and lots and lots of board feet of boardwalk in this area to elevate people up off of those sensitive soils and also up above sinkholes. All right, this is the main entrance to Grand Canyon. It's freaking huge. Most of us know what Mammoth Cave looks like inside. It's pretty okay. I mean, it's fine if you're into caving and stuff like that. That was not a typo. That really is over 400 miles of explored, mapped caves so far, networking in 5 or 6 levels above the Green River that runs through there. That's mining out the cave. 400 miles in a 36-mile area, and then a couple of long runners off outside the perimeter underground. It is a crazy, crazy, crazy cave system. Okay, so little brown bats, Indiana bats, stuff like that are present at this place. Okay, there's this white nose syndrome. I mean, if you have 1% of local populations surviving this kind of thing, like, that's enough to recover, but man, that's a hell of a hit. So the issue was the bats were coming under stress from Geomyces destructans, 99% of them dying, and then those that are left getting hammered pretty hard by visitor impacts and so forth. So it's like, man, let's try not to eradicate this last 1% on our watch. So the strategy here for this particular wildlife impact relative to this level of sensitivity, relative to these specific uses for recreation like caving and tourism caving, was to limit use. About 99% of the cave system, 99% of the mapped cave system is closed to public use. Those tours all sort of fold back on each other, and they're only using several miles of the 400 miles available. Now, it takes like a month of cave travel to get to some of the more distant mapped places on the cave system. So it's not practical for all visitors to visit all 400 miles. But they want to concentrate that impact where the highest value, the easiest access, the coolest looking cave, speleothems or flowstones, stalactites, stalagmites, soda straws, fairy castles, all that stuff. Evaporite minerals like gypsum. Let's find the stuff that's closest to the most accessible entrances, and the elevators they had to dynamite in, because at one point there was a full-service cafeteria inside Mammoth Cave for no good reason. We'll limit use to that, and we'll make that part of the cave a really high-quality tour. Like, for not a ton of money, you can go walk around for 4 hours and see the best of what Mammoth Cave has to offer near the surface, and hear from legitimate experts who are guiding you along the way. And if we do a real good job with that few percent of the miles of cave totally available, then the other 95 to 99% of that cave habitat, to the extent that bats are going to use it, is available and safe for the bats. It's functionally silent. It's still. And we don't have hundreds of thousands of people a year bringing in more Geomyces spores on their clothing and so forth. Okay? They also sought to reduce the impact of use by figuring out, okay, what do we do about those Geomyces spores? We know from studies that those spores get all over people when they get into a cave. It's like very, very, very fine dust that takes a really long time to settle. It's just like dry COVID particles, just kind of floating through the air in these cave systems. That's how the fungus spreads. So the question was, can we do anything about that? And the answer pretty quickly apparent from the northeastern United States, which had white nose syndrome showing up before it showed up and jumped to places like Mammoth Cave was once it's in a cave, it is going to kill 95 to 99% of those bats, period. That's just the toll we're going to pay because we want to use these caves recreationally. There's also some evidence that bats were spreading geomyces from cave to cave as well. But the question was pretty well settled on, can we prevent this from spreading? We can't. Can we help the bats survive it? We can't. What we can do is try and slow that spread and give our bat biologists enough time to improve habitat for other bats in other places by essentially sterilizing people's boot soles, which are covered in geomyces, by having everybody walk through a pine sol sponge bath on the way out of the cave. So Mammoth Cave already has geomyces. The bats that are surviving are able to live through. They're a little bit more resistant to it and slowly repopulating, maybe, hopefully. So we can't stop the impact, but we can mitigate it, right? And if that's the best we can do, then that's what we'll do. So that means putting in airlocks on the cave faces, putting in gates at Ozark Scenic Riverways. God, I don't even know how many cave mouths and sinkholes they hiked angle iron and truck battery powered welding kits out to, and just welded iron gates into a bunch of these caves that the bats can fly through and humans can't. So hardening up the facility, controlling access, also very important in Mammoth Cave, because if you have some kids wandering into the cave at night because they're bored, for example, they're going to get in trouble real fast. So physical site control, site access control, very important for this particular part. The site design tried to basically make sections of the grand entrance part of the cave, it's paved in hexagonal tiles. And there's a low concrete wall on both sides of that, like 20-foot wide path. Like, it's a big area, plenty of space to build essentially permanent paths into this cave. It's a geologically stable spot. Those tiles could be there for thousands of years and still just doing their job. All right, so site design, let's harden it up. Let's get people physically separated up off the floor of the cave, and we won't be wrecking the floor of the cave with our boot soles. We'll maintain all of this. We will custom weld at a cost of $15,000 to $45,000 per step, thousands of stainless steel steps and staircases throughout the cave system, so that we don't have to scramble up rocks and make a bunch of noise, screw up the very, very sensitive chemistry and acoustic environment and so forth. And then the regulations, they read you the riot act before you get in that cave. And then being ready to enforce those laws and put some teeth behind them so that people actually follow it, okay? So, drilling down on those. Gates. The white nose syndrome station, filled with pine sol that you walk through, kind of a spongy mat, and sterilize it and slow down the spread of white nose to everywhere else. So if you go to Mammoth Cave and you're on a big road trip, you want to get the idea to go to Carlsbad Caverns, you've got millions of spores in your clothing and on your boots, you're now causing patient zero at Carlsbad, right? That's how it goes. So there is that. And then on the regulatory enforcement side, they don't give you a choice. You're going to do this. If you want to go on the cave, you have to do this, which is a pretty confrontational stance for the American National Park Service. Like, you don't see a lot of notices like this. So when you do see one, you know they serious. Okay. Check this out. You think this changes your experience if you have to wear the clothes provided to you by the federal government? some people are not cool with that. But the Park Service doesn't have any room to budge on this. Like, if we get this wrong, that last 1% of bats, pretty sensitive, could easily die out. So, there's 100% complete access control, including down to the clothes that you wear on some of the tours, where that matters. And this one's a little bit tough. Intercepting visitors carrying private caving gear. Because the cave network extends out beyond the borders of the park, you can have people coming in from some of these other caves, or just new cave entrances that people have found, or a few that people have dynamited in over the years. This would be an issue, right? So we have to work out a very specific kind of law enforcement that is also able to do presence detection and interdiction in the cave system from exogenous entrances. Pretty cool stuff. I'll put this on the website. We don't have to or need to watch those now, but the Park Service has put together some pretty palatable videos about what's going on to help people understand that information and education approach of why are we going through airlocks? Why am I walking through pine saw? Why am I wearing government-issued overalls? Is this a gulag? What's going on? This doesn't seem like freedom to me. Does anybody know the TV show Dirty Jobs? Mike Rowe, the narrator, real deep voice, kind of a, burly guy, right? Good narrator voice. They got him to do a bunch of the videos for use at Mammoth Cave because he was a recognized and trusted public communication figure, to kind of boil down a little bit of the science and help people understand, hey, this is why we're doing this stuff. And it's nothing against you. We're really excited you're here. We just need to do a couple of things in really particular ways so that this place doesn't completely collapse. Thanks for coming. Okay. So, switching context now to, this was a target of opportunity thing while I was doing other research at Acadia National Park. So this is a bald eagle near an unhomed person's sort of backcountry campsite. That's a seawall. That's the Atlantic Ocean right there. And this area, there was a dead bald eagle, which is like a very serious federal offense if somebody's shooting bald eagles and they're not a Native Americans, First Nations person with the legal right to do that for traditional use, headdress, that kind of thing. We had to investigate this. So the Park Service got the call that an eagle was dead and down very near to this spot, about 50 yards from here. So the question was, did this person poach the animal? Did somebody else maybe leave any evidence? And so forth. So we did the on-site investigation and found a whole bunch of other resource impacts of this person using essentially a bunch of stolen dimensional lumber and driftwood to build a shelter. This is very, very, very slow-growing, nutrient-depleted boreal forest entisol soil, highly acidic. It's hard for stuff to grow here. So any kind of trampling impact can last for years and years and years. Here, a lot more than we would think about it or be concerned about it on the Shawnee, for example. If we're crashing through the woods in the Shawnee, it's going to be completely unrecognizable and healed up, in a year or two. Not a big deal. So then we found, located the bald eagle that somebody had called in about and checked it for tags or banding, and both legs were banded. A lot of bald eagles are tracked in this country these days. And then we did basically a necropsy, which is the animal version of an autopsy. Looking for bullet holes, looking for signs of abuse or laceration. And in this particular case, it looks like the bald eagle died of a natural cause. But we had to investigate it, right? So this is kind of one example or a photo essay of the enforcement side of things, right? When we get any evidence or a tip-off of stuff like this, then you know, we're rolling pretty hot pretty fast, because if this thing had been shot, then we've got somebody with a gun in a national park shooting a national icon species, and like gonna go to federal no conjugal visits prison for a while if they get caught. And so it's also a safety risk. Like, somebody who's willing to shoot a bald eagle, is this an attack on a national symbol? Is this a terrorist act? Right? We have to ask those questions in this particular case. So, all's well that ended well. It was okay, but yeah, we have to jump in. We just don't know until we do that investigation. So, interdiction and enforcement, direct enforcement, are absolutely a part of park rangering work. Now, it's specifically law enforcement rangers who are federal agents. You know, they train at one of the FBI compounds. You know, they can make arrests. They have all sorts of weapons and body armor and all that stuff. And they are doing a lot of policing with millions of people in areas the size of Carbondale, right? If you were here in 2017 and you remember how just stupid this place got with people during the eclipse, imagine 10, 100, 1,000 times that. Like, it's a lot.